paradox of this is that my job is not to be the expert. You know, as a coach, my job is to help you tap into your own expertise.
It is,
so
but you're not here as a coach.
This is my challenge, right?
Hello, it's Simon, and today's guest on Just About Coping is Tony Piper. Tony is a stress and burnout coach who first reached out to me on social media when I wrote an article about avoiding summer burnout, and he took me to task a bit, saying, good article, but you've forgotten one key point, which is to make sure that workplaces are doing everything they can to remove the causes of burnout in the first place. So I'm delighted that Tony's here. We talked about burnout, we talked about stress, we talked about self-care, and if you're interested in those things, I'm sure you're going to enjoy listening to this conversation with Tony. So do you want to just tell me a bit about who you are and how you came to be a person who likes talking about burnout?
Well, it's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Simon. So I'm a coach. Before I became a coach, I had a 27-year career in the IT industry, but I was always much more interested in the people side of things as much as the tech. And over the years, I had my own experiences of things that I would later come to understand to be certainly on the road to burnout, if not total burnout. Mm-hmm. And what I realized as I transitioned into being a coach is that this can be quite a common journey for a lot of people, especially people who are high achievers, especially people who are maybe promoted quite rapidly at a young age, and that was a lot of my story. Maybe people who have quite a caring disposition. There are all sorts of factors that can combine and mean that in some situations you can be quite prone to this. And I suppose this is one of those law of attraction things, is that once you start thinking about this, then you start meeting people who are in this situation. And I find myself working with people who are going through this at the moment.
And so the World Health Organization defined burnout as an occupational phenomenon earlier this year. And what they have described it as, just so that we're really clear what we're talking about, is a syndrome which is conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Talk about three dimensions, so feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. And then they talk about burnout referring specifically to phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life.
Right.
And so I think it's just really important, because so often we will talk about feeling burnt out, and yes. Yet we're in this context at least talking about it in a very specific sort of context. So if you were to just reflect a bit about what it is that you talked about the types of people that you've seen, but what is it that in your experience leads to people getting that sense of burnout? Is it too much to do, too much on the to-do list? Is it that the work is outside the technical skills? Are there particular things which you experience lead to burnout, or is it more random than that?
Well, the clue to that is in chronic unmanaged stress, which is in that definition you just read out. And those stresses could be all sorts of things. You've already named some of them. So it could be about workload. If you're working 18-hour days for a long period of time, you're going to get physically exhausted, right? If you're doing work that is boring, what's going to happen to you? If you're being managed in a way that's not right for you, which is too much management or too little management, what's going to happen to you? What happens if you fall out of alignment with the values of your organization? Maybe they've changed over the years. Maybe there's been a merger and acquisition situation where all of a sudden a new culture has come in and you're suddenly, this isn't the company I used to work for. Often it can be a perfect storm. And the interesting thing about the WHO definition is they talk about workplace stress. In my experience as a coach, what I'm finding is that often it's workplace stress coinciding with other stress.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the challenge for employers, of course, is that you don't necessarily know what's going on outside the workplace.
Yeah.
You don't know if somebody is, for example, caring for a relative, and normally they can manage that, and they've got flexible working, and they're managing to keep that going. But then what happens when that relative goes into hospital, for example? And as an employer, you may know about it, or you may not know about it. And meanwhile, it's month end, or there's a surprise unannounced audit team arriving, or Ofsted inspection, or whatever it could be. And often these things all come together, and that could be the final thing that tips you into towards the end stages of burnout. But it's important to say that burnout is a gradual journey. The flame doesn't suddenly go out, it sort of flickers and dims.
Yeah, yeah.
But it does eventually go out.
So just tell us, what does burnout look like? How do you know it's happening?
Well, it's this gradual journey of physical and emotional exhaustion, of cynicism about work, and about a lack of sort of achievement, sort of ineffectiveness, maybe. Right? It's those three things that are in that World Health Organization definition. So to unpack those a little bit more, physical and emotional exhaustion. I mean, physical exhaustion, we know when we're tired, but it could be other things like, ongoing headaches, or stomach trouble, or maybe blurry vision, or can't concentrate and focus. We might be emotionally up and down. We might be more sad than we usually are, or all sorts of other. I mean, people respond emotionally to stress in all sorts of ways. Some people almost get quite sort of high on it. Almost, I've seen this, which is an interesting response. But you'll know when physically and emotionally things are off, I think, is the safest thing to say. All right, and then the next one is about cynicism and about how do you feel about your job. Are you achieving anything? And if you do achieve it, is it valuable? What's the point? These kind of questions start to come up. Why am I bothering to do this? Am I making a difference? Which sort of touches on the values stuff. Am I actually doing work that's important to me? Am I connected to work that's important to me? And then finally, the performance piece. Am I getting stuff done? Am I doing it to the right standard? Have people noticed whether I am or am not doing that? Right. So there are those three groups, and that's in the World Health definition. There are 4 questions I think you can ask yourself on a regular basis. The first one is, how well am I sleeping? Am I getting to sleep quickly? And not because maybe I've had half a bottle of wine or some sleeping tablets or anything else. And once I get asleep, am I staying asleep during the night? Or am I waking up in the middle of the night worrying about stuff that's going on? So that's the first one. Second one is, how do I feel when I wake up? Am I refreshed? Am I excited about the day ahead? Or is it something else? Third one, leaving work, am I switching off? Both physically in terms of my apps, am I looking at my notifications and email and all the rest of it, or mentally, am I churning things around in my head, and thinking about what's just happened in the day in a way that's kind of ruminating rather than reflecting, or am I worrying about the stuff I haven't done, or am I worrying about an email that's going to come in from the East Coast team in the middle of the evening, and somebody's going to want an answer because we're a global company, and that's kind of expected of me. So are you switching off? And then the final one is just about how am I with my relationships? Am I getting irritated with people? Or am I withdrawing from people? They're the 2 classic signs of that. So you can ask yourself those 4 questions on a regular basis. And, the how, if you want to add to that, how do I feel on Sunday evening? Am I looking forward to the week ahead, or have I got this sort of Sunday night blues? And, if this is going on for a while, then the chances are there's something you need to do about this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. You just reminded me. I did a commencement speech at my Cardiff University graduation ceremony last year, and life isn't always up, but if it's if it's down, a lot, then what are the changes that need to be making? And it's if one Sunday doesn't feel great, fine, but if 7 Sundays in a row don't feel great, then there's different.
This is the chronic word in that WHO definition. It's about something that's gone on for a period of time. Because as you say, there will be fluctuations. There's an end stage of burnout where the flame does go out, and for many people it can feel like a very strange absence of stuff going on in their head. A lot of the times when we're anxious and stressed about work, we have these voices in our head telling us about all the things that we have or haven't done and how well it didn't go and the problem with that person and, oh, if only this, and all this internal dialogue that goes on. And one of the things about burnout is that all of that just stops and you're absolutely numb and there's nothing going on. And when you wake up in the morning, you don't even dread work because you're not even thinking about anything and you just can't get up. And if you do get up, you're not going to get anything done. It's this very strange state. And I always think with a lot of these responses to stress, it's helpful to think about, this is the body's way of telling you need to do something. Right? And burnout, like some of the other consequences of stress, like we talked about heart disease and this kind of thing, this is your body really getting quite serious about this now, and it's like, if you're not going to do anything about this, I'm going to stop you even getting out of bed. This is the ultimate nope.
Which is what Ruby in the first episode described as, our body's a onesie. We often think of our brain and our bodies as separate, but actually we've got this onesie which is going on. And of course, that the asking ourselves the questions. And we have a weekly checkup set of questions on MHFA England's website, is about trying to ensure that we can notice and get help, get support, take action before that stage. But clearly, it's really vital that people do get that help and support at the point that burnout does happen.
This is why all of this is so important, because this is the end result. This is what happens if you don't.
Absolutely. So you're in bed, you're lying there, you can't get up. My phrase I think I would use at that point is that you just want the world to do one. What happens? What advice would we be giving? What should people be thinking about?
Well, the first thing you need to do is get some rest, and that might be a week or so of bed rest. It could be that you need to go on holiday, and if you're one of these people that doesn't take your holiday allowance, this is your time to correct that and get some time out of the situation. And hopefully you have an employer who's understanding and you can talk to them about this. If not, you might need to see a GP, and your GP is going to be wanting to know about the things that led up to this, just in case there's other things going on as well. So I think it's probably good practice to talk to a GP about this. Once you've started to rest and recharge, on the basis that you are able to do that, the next thing you need to do is to identify the source of your stress and think about everything going on in your life. As I said before, this is often a perfect storm of workplace and personal stress that's going on. So it might be that by themselves, those sources of stress are manageable, but it's the way they've come together. And then you're going to need to put some work in to figure out whether you can eliminate those sources of stress or whether you can respond to them in different ways. It could be that some simple workplace adjustments or some stronger boundaries about timekeeping and making sure you're going home and switching off could be the thing that helps you. But it might be that there's something about your role that needs to change. Maybe you've been, covering for other people, and that's the article that brought us together in the first place around summer burnout, where you're covering for people. It might be that's been going on for a bit too long. It might be that you're manager is also burning out and they've been pushing everything onto you because they can't cope with it. And, guess what? That's going to affect you. It might be that...
So I guess just to... sorry to interrupt on that. So it feels like what you're really saying is it's that deep reflection on where, what, and then trying to work out how to eliminate, to manage, and to...
And it might be that you can do that yourself, or it might be it's easier to talk through with somebody else.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to necessarily be somebody who's an expert in this.
Yeah.
It's just somebody who can listen and ask the questions.
Yeah, yeah. And as with all these situations, the most important thing is never thinking that you're alone, and never thinking that you have to do these things on your own, and that talking, helping, asking for help is absolutely the bravest and best thing to do in all of these situations.
Yeah.
In your role as a coach, where you've been working with people, you will obviously have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's often easier to talk about when things go wrong. But are there examples that you can draw on where you think about where managers, organisations, HR, whoever, manage to get it right, either to prevent the burnout in the first place, or to ensure that somebody was adequately supported through the process of recovery?
Okay, so preventing burnout is all about identifying and managing the sources of stress. Okay, so that could be learning to cope with those sources of stress differently, or ideally removing them altogether. Some things you can remove, some things you can't. And organizations that have managers who are well trained at really checking in with their employees, maybe they're also organizations that are really paying attention to employee engagement. Maybe they're organizations that see the need for mental health first aid practitioners. These are all organizations that are more likely to be having the kind of conversation about how an employee is feeling about showing up at work and how they're doing, what needs to change, if anything, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Yeah. And if you were to, the corollary of that, think about just being really explicit where organisations are not addressing the factors of burnout, or not noticing when people are being stressful. Are there any sort of real key things which organisations are failing to do in those moments? I mean, it's a slightly obvious question. They're failing to know stress. They're failing to remove the stressors. But are there any sort of insights which you've got through the process in which you can think about that?
Well, I had one yesterday that came up, and that was about, we're getting to the end of the year, and I was thinking about people who, and I'd had my own experience of this, where people can carry forward or cash in their holiday entitlement. Okay, that's quite a big red flag, because it says you've not taken time off. Now, there might be good reason for that. Maybe you're saving for a big trip to the other side of the world, but it might be that you felt unable to take that time off because there's a culture of sort of presenteeism, where you have to be at work and be seen to be arriving at work before your line manager and leaving afterwards. And that if you take time off, then maybe that would be perceived as a sign of not coping, or back to this quote unquote bravery thing. But there can be these cultures that just reward people for working very, very long hours, and ultimately that's going to unravel. I do some work with people in consultancy, and they're all famous for working very, very long hours, often away from home, for long stints on very challenging projects. Without the right amount of self-care, they are quite dangerous places to work.
And so we'll come back to self-care a bit in a moment, but I guess just to be really interesting to just talk about holidays and the importance of people taking holidays. And one of the things which I know from personal experience is that you can either go on holiday and properly go on holiday, where you turn the phone off and you don't do anything, or you can go on holiday and you're basically still at work, just not in the office. If you were thinking about your clients, clearly we as employers have responsibilities, but also as people, as employees, we also have our own responsibilities to turn off our phones, etc. Yeah, are there ways that people that you've worked with have coached themselves away from their phones, coached themselves away from checking the emails, and really recognise that life can go on without being connected into work whilst taking time out?
Certainly, there are some organisations where, for example, you have to have a work phone and a private phone, and you can't access work email on your private phone. And for as much of a pain that can be, carrying two phones around and keeping them charged and everything else, it does mean that you can give your work phone to your manager the day before you go on holiday. And some organisations I know will turn off access to email for people who are going on holiday, which I think is a really progressive thing. Some organisations will have a culture where it's definitely frowned upon to send messages to people who you know to be on holiday, and it's something that you can expect to get some feedback on if you do it. Now, of course, with automated emails for groups and all the rest of it, that can be hard to avoid, but certainly creating a culture where I didn't want to disturb you on holiday, so I'm not going to, is a lot more than, well, I'm going to send it and know that you'll come back to an inbox of 500 emails.
Yeah.
So there's things we can do for each other as colleagues, let alone as managers, to make it easier for each other to take proper time out, right? I mean, the way I always think about self-care is that self-care is the thing that charges you up in order to care about other people and other things. So you start with self-care. It's not something you do to fix things after you've run out. Yeah. It's how you start from a place of caring for self. Because if you can't care for yourself, you can't care for anybody else.
Yeah. And I learned a thing this week, actually, which is that you can get all of your apps to close down at a certain time of night. So that it's not tempting, or it's not quite as easy. It's an extra couple of clicks in order to be able to get to your email. So for anybody that hasn't found it, there isn't a facility on most phones now that you can get everything to close down a particular time. And I've this week set mine to 8 p.m.
Fantastic.
Let's see whether I stick to it.
Well, and I can't wait for the day they allow you to set a PIN number. That is the thing that lets you get back into the apps, so that you can give that PIN number to somebody else and ask them for permission before you quickly sort of succumb to the urge to override it.
Never share PIN numbers. That's what we learn in our financial well-being classes.
Don't use the same PIN as your bank card.
So let's just move forward. Let's start thinking a little bit about some states of utopia. And thinking about, if we were creating work cultures where burnout just wasn't something which was on the cards for most people, what things would be being in place? What would chief execs like me or managers be doing and thinking about in order to try and eliminate the risks of people experiencing burnout?
The first thing I would say to any chief exec is to take responsibility for your own well-being. Because if you're not well, the chances are the rest of us aren't going to be well. Because as you struggle to cope, then it's probably going to have a ripple effect. And one of the things that is often underlooked with well-being and engagement is around some kind of assumption that the people near the top of the organisation are feeling better about things than the people who report to them. And that often isn't true. And as we know, if you're a chief exec, it can be a lonely place. And maybe you don't have people that you can confide in. Maybe you don't have the psychological safety to say, you know what, I'm really finding this hard. I'm going to get some help. Can you help me with this? That kind of bravery. And, you know, we see the gritted teeth and the determination to carry on. And, you know, if you can't look after yourself, if you can't stay well, then what hope for the rest of us? So that's the first thing to say. So create a culture. And this is what Brené Brown talks about with this culture of vulnerability, vulnerable leadership rather than armored leadership. Mm-hmm. So as a chief exec, being able to turn around and say, I'm finding this really hard, or I don't know what to do. Let's try and figure it out together. Can you help me? Those kind of things are more likely to create the psychological safety that says, oh, okay, yeah, the chief exec isn't some kind of superhero. They're just another human being in a particular role. And it's okay to say, I need help.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you don't go down that route, then one of the signals that you send is that somehow you're in that role as a chief exec because you're somehow, have superpowers or invincible or
sat here in my
that
cape,
kind of thing.
For those who can't see.
Right? And whether that's what you intended, that's often how it's received. Okay, and people will tend to put people in authority on pedestals, and that's probably not very helpful. And certainly, if they see behaviours in leaders that are unhealthy, there may be some kind of signalling that says this is what we do around here. So it has to start. This is back to the self-care thing. It has to start with you, and it has to start at the top.
Yeah, and
to model the behaviours that you want to see in everybody else.
Yeah. So, okay, let's get personal for a moment. So your self-care, how do you look after yourself?
I do go to the gym. I am one of those people. I didn't used to be, actually, and I used to have all sorts of problems as a result of it. So it's only in fairly recent years that I've become that person. And I enjoy being outside. I enjoy being out on my bike. I have my little folding Brompton, which probably looks like a clown bike from a distance, but actually it brings me much joy. And I'm also a singer. And until recently, I did a professional job singing for 7 years, and I'm having a bit of a break from that, but that brings me a lot of joy. And if I'm not doing that, I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting enough sleep and that I'm not putting too many harmful substances in my body in any one moment, and just paying attention to what my body tells me about how I'm feeling and what I need to do.
Interesting. Say a bit more about that.
Well, I think recognizing that, we all have limited reserves of energy, and at any given moment, they're going to be drained in all sorts of different ways. So for me, for example, it might be a surprising fact to some people, but actually I'm quite introverted. And, yet I'm a coach. I spend all my day with people. And I know that if I've done 6 hours of coaching, I'm going to be no good for anybody. And what I'll need to do is just to go home and curl up with a book and not talk to anybody. And then, in the morning, I'm fine. But if I was then to be booked into a party, that evening or some other kind of social gathering, I wouldn't show up in the way that I wanted to show up. So it's about having the self-awareness and acceptance that you can't do everything.
Tony, thank you. I think, I just want to end by really just going back to that sort of definition and reminding people that what burnout is about chronic workplace stress that
Right.
isn't managed, and work will be stressful sometimes, but it is our absolute responsibility as line managers, as chief execs, as organisations to ensure that stresses are managed, that staff are supported, and that alongside that organisational responsibility, there's also the personal responsibility that we all have to do the best we can to look after ourselves. So thank you for your challenge to me in the first place, which was don't just deal with the symptoms, make sure that you're trying to do everything you can to prevent it in the first place. I appreciated that deeply, and thanks very much for coming to talk to me today.
My pleasure.
So I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Tony. If you want to find out more about Tony and his work, go to his website, tonypiper.coach. Next week will be the last episode in this series of Just About Coping, and I'm delighted that my final guest is Phil Apokajima. And Phil is the Executive Director of the Kaleidoscope Trust and founder of UK Black Pride. So just to finish this episode of Just About Coping, a couple of reviews. One person talking about the conversation with Johnny Benjamin really found the point about hope and the importance of hope at the point of diagnosis and in conversations was really powerfully made. And a second review on iTunes which said, just finished listening to Simon interviewing Dr. Ranj. Stuff to relate to, stuff to get inspired by, stuff to make you optimistic, and stuff to make you laugh. Thank you very much for all of your reviews. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of these conversations. Please do continue to leave us reviews on iTunes. Please do continue to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag JAC podcast. I'm Simon Blake. Thanks very much for coping with us.